May 25th, 1953. A first-of-its-kind nuclear artillery shell detonates at the U.S. government's Nevada test site with the same yield as the bomb that obliterated Hiroshima, Japan, 8 years earlier. A mushroom cloud of vaporized material and radioactive particles, fallout, rises into the skies directly behind where I'm standing right now. The blast, part of Operation Upshot Knothole, was one of 11 such nuclear tests that would occur in 1953. A year later, in the June of 1954, hundreds of Hollywood cast and crew would descend upon the desert to begin filming The Conqueror, just 220 kilometers downwind. Some of Hollywood's biggest Golden Age stars would spend 6 weeks filming in the dust and sand near St. George, Utah, where most of the fallout from previous nuclear tests had settled. Their set was demonstrably radioactive. In the decades to come, nearly half of the men and women who worked just a few weeks in this desert would either develop cancer or die from it, including Hollywood legend John Wayne. These striking statistics would make The Conqueror forever infamous for something other than bad acting and insensitive casting. Did a movie shot downwind from an atomic test site actually kill one of Hollywood's biggest stars? Or is there something more to these numbers? This is the true story of The Conqueror. At the height of his career, American film legend John Wayne made a mistake. After reading a script and lobbying for the role, the silver screen icon would appear in 1956's The Conqueror as an undeniably miscast Genghis Khan. The film did well enough at the box office and touted other Golden Age stars like Susan Hayward, but it was ripped apart by the reviews. The Conqueror is now widely considered one of the worst films of the 1950s and one of the worst films ever made. But was appearing in the film actually John Wayne's second big mistake? The Conqueror was partially shot in Utah. Deserts there flaunted gorgeous cliffs and vistas deemed acceptable stand-ins for the Himalayan steppe Genghis Khan once roamed. Specifically, outdoor scenes took place in the Escalante Desert near St. George, Utah, 220 kilometers downwind of the United States government's Nevada test site. Between 1951 and 1953, 31 nuclear warheads were detonated here in various configurations. Most were in the air, some were underground, and one, the Grable shot, was via artillery. The city of St. George was the populated area that received the most significant dusting of nuclear fallout from these explosions, and in 1954, it was also a movie set. The filmmakers knew about the town's troubling distinction before they got there. Wayne would even take his sons out with a Geiger counter for surveys, but they were assured that the location was very safe to shoot in. For 6 weeks, horses kicked up dust, actors tussled in the sand. After location shooting was completed, one of the producers would have 120,000 kilograms of that same Utah earth shipped to sound stages in California for reshoots. The Conqueror premiered in Los Angeles on February 22, 1956. Posters boasted about its budget and how long the film took to make. John McCartan of The New Yorker called the film pure Hollywood moonshine. You never saw so many horses fall down in your life. Still, their tumbling is far superior to the antics of the actors. The film earned $4.5 million and was the 11th most successful film at the North American box office in 1956. Being a bad movie should have been all you needed to know about The Conqueror's legacy. But 7 years after it premiered, director Dick Powell died of cancer. Supporting actor Pedro Armendariz was diagnosed with kidney cancer in 1960 and killed himself in June 1963. Then Agnes Moorehead died in 1974. Then co-star Susan Hayward in 1975. John Wayne died of stomach cancer in 1979. 1 year later, in 1980, a Bombshell magazine article would call into question the circumstances of these deaths, simultaneously immortalizing a movie that would have been forgotten and galvanizing a special community of people to unprecedented legal action. What is nuclear fallout? Popular culture seems pretty confused on this point. Is it some sort of toxic cloud floating through the air? Is it some unexploded hunk of plutonium in a crater somewhere? When a nuclear bomb goes off, there are so-called fission products produced, atoms left over after large unstable nuclei are split to release energy. Bombs aren't 100% efficient, so there are also unfissioned atoms left over. Both are radioactive. And then there's the material from the bomb itself, casing, metal, all vaporized by the fireball. All of this will condense, cool, and combine with any nearby atoms. If a nuclear bomb goes off in the air, it might cool, combine, and condense into the sort of blackened rain that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. If a bomb explodes near the ground, large amounts of earth are atomized, contaminated, and thrust skyward. Nuclear fallout is the contaminated soot, ash, dust, and earth after a nuclear explosion. Depending on the half-lives of the atoms involved, it can go on to contaminate a large area for a very long time. For example, the nuclear testing that happened here in the 1950s is still detectable worldwide in the atmosphere to this day. From the 1950s through the 1970s, a new classification emerged among the communities in Nevada, Washington, Idaho, New Mexico, and Arizona adjacent to nuclear testing: downwinders. The term itself is radioactive, so to speak. Downwinder implies that being downwind of nuclear testing and the subsequent fallout affected you and your livelihood personally through no fault of your own. Nevada test site workers, farmers, and ordinary men and women in the shadow of mushroom clouds would come together in these decades as downwinders to bring government attention to what they considered fallout-induced damages. Many would claim, and continue to claim to this day, that their general ailments, cancers, and loss of livestock were caused by particularly dirty atomic bombs. It was the downwinders who gave the hairy shot of Operation Upshot Knothole on May 19, 1953, a new nickname: Dirty Harry, after a fallout cloud drifted over St. George and a public health service monitor told everyone in town to take cover. For decades, the downwinders were ready to be listened to, and after a widely circulated report in 1977 and a study in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1979, they felt that someone had finally heard them. The article, Childhood Leukemias Associated with Fallout from Nuclear Testing, found that there was no correlation between cancers and fallout exposure in Utah counties during and after atomic testing, with the exception of childhood leukemia. There was an observed 2.44 times increase in mortality among those studied, despite the fact that the lead author of the study, Dr. Joseph Lyon, said that we can't from this study say that fallout causes cancer, despite the fact that this increase brought leukemia rates in Utah in line with the national average. The apparent recognition of decades of downwinder suffering was now impossible to dismiss, valid or not. 3 months after the 1979 Utah fallout studies shook the downwinders, John Wayne died from a protracted battle with throat, lung, and stomach cancers and shook the world. 2 months after that, Peter Brennan, a reporter for the national tabloid The Star, connected the two events. He knew that the Conqueror had shot in Utah, exactly where the downwinder study had looked. He knew that the death of John Wayne was perfect tabloid fodder, and to make the story as titillating as possible, he suggested that the US government, via atomic negligence, had an indirect hand in the Duke's death. Brennan's story instantly caught fire and was picked up in the New York Post, Los Angeles Times, and the Times in London. Of course, Brennan's theory was complete speculation, and he had no direct contact with any of the Conqueror's cast or crew. But, as is the sinister nature of misinformation, that didn't matter. Reporters for outlets across the country started reaching out to any downwinder willing to share their story. On October 1st of the same year, People magazine spoke with an elderly resident of St. George, Utah, who detailed her battle with the government and her plan to unite hundreds of other residents for a lawsuit totaling $230 million. The People article would fan the flames further, citing the scientific study back in February and distorting it by claiming that, quote, St. George is plagued by an extraordinarily high rate of cancer. Everything came to a head on November 10, 1980, when after 14 months of tracking down all the cast and crew of the Conqueror they could find, People magazine ran a bombshell article entitled, "The Children of John Wayne, Susan Hayward, and Dick Powell Fear That Fallout Killed Their Parents." In it, the authors alleged some shocking statistics, backed up by convincing quotes. Of the Conqueror's 220 cast and crew members from Hollywood, the article reads, an astonishing 91 have contracted cancer, People has ascertained. With these numbers, this case could qualify as an epidemic, Dr. Robert C. Pendleton, director of radiological health at the University of Utah, told the magazine. In a group this size, you'd only expect some 30-some cancers to develop. With 91, I think the tie-in to their exposure on the set of The Conqueror would hold up even in a court of law. People's reporting would also prompt a now famous anonymous quote from the Pentagon. "Please, God, don't let us have killed John Wayne." The 1980 People magazine article remains the single most cited source for claims that the Conqueror killed John Wayne and ultimately 45 other cast and crew members. It's one of the first things you find if you research the origin of the Downwinders, and you will see the article's statistics in almost every single discussion of these 40 years of fear and loathing 65 miles north of Las Vegas. 220 cast and crew members, 91 developed cancer during their lifetime, 46 died from it. This represented 41% and 21% of the small population respectively, and this alarmed everyone. But should it have? How do you know if one thing causes another? How do you really know that correlation does not mean causation? One thing that every good scientist has to do is eliminate confounding variables. Variables that, if you don't control for them, can make connections that don't exist. For example, it would not be hard to use data to find a real correlation between increased ice cream sales and shark attacks. It sounds crazy, but that's because there's a confounding variable here that we aren't controlling for, namely increases in outdoor temperature. Summertime sweets and swimming is actually influencing both ice cream sales and shark attacks, making it look like there's a connection where there isn't one. Thinking about confounding variables, consider this. John Wayne was a famously addicted smoker. He smoked up to 6 packs a day. He had a cigarette assistant on his film sets. He posed with cigarettes. He did ads for cigarettes. If Wayne was awake for maybe 10 hours a day, then he smoked an average of 1 cigarette every 5 minutes. It's entirely possible that some days he breathed in as much smoke as he did air. While it's difficult to pin a specific cancer to a specific cause, the best we can do is heavily correlate the two. Is the relationship between John Wayne's throat, lung, and stomach cancer a result of working on the Conqueror? Or is it heavy smoking that is a confounding variable? The 1980 People magazine article certainly did its diligence in contacting Conqueror cast members and sourcing expert quotes. What it did not do was correlate its claims with the science at the time. Of 220 cast and crew, People uncovered that 41% of them eventually got cancer and 21% of them died from it. According to the National Cancer Institute, for the year the article was published, for the age of the cast and crew at the time, the chances of being diagnosed with a cancer sometime in your lifetime was 41 to 43%, with a mortality rate of 21 to 23%. In other words, the cancer rate for the cast and crew of the Conqueror were very uninteresting. The rates are so close to the national average, in fact, that invoking radioactive fallout to explain them is misleading. Comparing John Wayne's 6 weeks in Utah to the lifetime of a downwinder is specious at best. Comparing his time on set to studies of A-bomb survivors in Hiroshima, as was done, is even worse. Complicating the supposed connection, Dr. Robert C. Pendleton, the director of radiological health at the University of Utah, who told People magazine that these actually uninteresting cancer rates were an epidemic and would hold up in a court of law, he had a painful personal connection to the whole affair. He believed that his wife had died as a direct result of atomic testing. It led to conspiratorial thinking. 1 year before the People magazine article was published, a student newspaper quoted him as saying, "At the federal level, I think the dangers of atomic testing was a cover-up, and with my experience, I think it was by design and not by oversight." It would be difficult to call Dr. Pendleton an impartial observer. These were the small problems with the cancer claims. Of the 91 cancers that people reported, none of the types were mentioned, which could help identify if radiation was to blame. None of them had developed leukemia, for example, which has the strongest link to nuclear fallout. No medical records were obtained. Most everyone was nameless. It wasn't clear that all 220 cast and crew even came into contact with any radioactive material. The most recent nuclear test was over a year before anyone started filming. The official cast and crew list wasn't even 220 names. It was 108. And whatever the real number, these people weren't a random sample that you'd want for a proper medical analysis. They were heavy-smoking celebrities. 3 other movies shot in the exact same location from 1957 and 1979, and none of their casts or crews had abnormal rates of cancer. A local restaurant that catered the Conqueror in 1954 reported that none of its 55 staff members got cancer at all. None of this was surprising to another University of Utah scientist, Lynn Anspaugh, who later calculated that the Conqueror's cast and crew probably received no more than 1 to 4 millirems of radiation, about what you'd get sitting on a flight from New York to Los Angeles. Negligible. These radiation values put the absolute risk of the cast or crew of the Conqueror developing fatal cancers solely from their time in St. George at around 1 in a million. A dose that would support this fallout-stricken narrative would have to be at least 100,000 times higher, and at that point, nothing would be in question, as St. George, Utah, and the surrounding areas would be nothing but a radiated wasteland. Before he died in 1976, one of the Conqueror's producers, none other than Howard Hughes, reportedly bought up every copy of the film for $12 million in an attempt to bury it forever. He allegedly watched it on repeat in his home. One can only suspect that it was shame that kept the eccentric billionaire fighting for the movie's rights and copies, but Paramount reacquired the rights to the film 3 years after Hughes' death, and you can find it on Blu-ray today. Throughout the 70s and 80s, the downwinders and their representatives kept fighting. Witnesses alleged government cover-ups, claimants made hundreds of unsuccessful lawsuits, judge-ordered fallout damage payments from the government were overturned. Starting in 1986 and continuing for years, a total of 536 protests would be held at the Nevada test site. 37,000 people would demonstrate over nuclear weapons and weapons testing. Almost 16,000 of them would be arrested. After decades of unsuccessful lawsuits and pressure from politicians who answered to the downwinders in their states, on October 15, 1990, George H.W. Bush signed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act into law. It offered a one-time benefit payment to, quote, persons who may have developed cancer or other specified disease after being exposed to radiation from atomic weapons testing. It's as close to an acknowledgement and an apology that the downwinders would ever get. Depending on where you worked, for how long, and what disease you developed, you'd be eligible for up to $100,000. You didn't have to prove nuclear fallout was involved, only that you lived in those areas at those times and had one of those diseases. To this day, the first thing that returns when you search for downwinders are lawyers looking to get you compensated. As of 2018, the RECA has paid out over $2 billion across 34,000 claims. None of this, however, not the Compensation Act nor the successful payouts, actually proves anyone was ever harmed by fallout from atomic testing, as extensive as it may have been. To the downwinders, questioning what they truly believe is a real cause for what ails them will sound like heresy, much like it does to those claiming, incorrectly, that they were harmed during the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster. But put aside any emotional response or political acquiescence, and it seems scientifically valid to question whether or not downwinders exist as a unique population of harmed peoples. Could it instead be that atomic testing is a more satisfying explanation, less random, than the sad, random fact that half of us who grow old will get cancer? In the 1980s, when panic over atomic testing and its effects were at their peak, many studies were done to try and reconcile what downwinders were claiming with actual data. Dr. Joseph Lyon, who published that 1979 study that People magazine used to signal an epidemic of cancers, did a follow-up study. Small or non-significant links. No epidemic. Dr. Glenn Caldwell of the CDC didn't find a connection either. U.S. Department of Energy medical researchers Harold L. Beck and Philip W. Cray found that the higher incidence of childhood leukemia in Utah could not be linked to fallout from the Nevada test site. Instead, they found that there was more traces of fallout from nuclear testing in Russia than there was from the bombs that supposedly contaminated the Conqueror set. Today, the scientific consensus is that there is no conclusive link between the fallout from atomic testing and cancer rates in the surrounding areas. As Dr. Daniel Miles says in his book, The Phantom Fallout-Induced Cancer Epidemic in Southwestern Utah, Downwinders Deluded and Waiting to Die, quote, "No one questions the existence of human tragedies in Utah or anywhere else. A family that has a child with leukemia has suffered real tragedy, whatever caused it," end quote. There is no doubt that downwinders experienced real pain, but real pain misdirected. It makes perfect sense to a non-expert that getting cancer after you're in the shadow of a very real mushroom cloud means that the two are linked. Doctors deal with people every day who believe vaccines harm their child because an illness unfortunately happened at the same time as a shot. But we do science exactly because this confirmation bias is so persuasive. The reality is that Utah has the lowest cancer mortality rate in the United States. And the downwinders, directly in the path of atomic testing, they have one of the lowest cancer mortality rates in the state with the lowest cancer mortality rate. It is extremely unlikely that atomic testing from the 1950s onwards here killed John Wayne. It is similarly unlikely that so-called downwinders have suffered and are suffering in some sort of nuclear wasteland. This isn't that. Nuclear fallout here is very real, just not really harmful. Even John Wayne's family were skeptical at the time of these tabloid claims, and reportedly, right before John Wayne's death, he said that, quote, "The Conqueror was the worst film I ever made, and it was a huge success." Until next time.